The desert wind carried whispers of the past as the rider dismounted, dust clinging to his boots, memories clinging harder. Jake Thorn thought he'd buried every ghost back in those blood-soaked canyons, until she stepped from the shadows of the firelight. Her eyes, dark, familiar, unshaken. "Jake," she said softly, "I'm your childhood love." Time stopped. The years, the wars, the silence, all of it vanished beneath that single truth. He lifted her gently, her weight no more than a memory, and carried her toward the lonely cabin where destiny waited to remember them both. Before we ride deeper into the story, if the spirit of the old frontier still stirs your heart, the campfire tales, the courage, the dust, and the honor, then saddle up with us. Hit subscribe and ring the bell so you'll never miss another ride through the legends of the Wild West. Now, let's get back to the trail. The sun bled low over the mesas, spilling red across a land that had forgotten mercy. Jake Thorn rode through the dust like a ghost returning to haunt what was left of his own story. His horse's hoofs struck rhythm on the parched earth, steady, hollow, each echo reminding him how far he'd ridden to find nothing but silence. Red masonry ahead, its crooked main street leaning under the weight of time, shutters banging like slow heartbeats. The old church steeple was rusted through, its bell long dead, and even the wind seemed reluctant to touch the place. Men stood outside the saloon, hands on their belts, eyes following him as if watching a storm roll in. He tipped his hat, slow, tired. The whispers came anyway. "That's Thorn." Thought he was dead. He'd heard it all before. Once a marshal, now just another drifter with too many ghosts trailing behind him. The saloon doors creaked when he pushed through, and the smell of cheap whiskey and older regrets hit him hard. Conversation stopped. Somewhere, a piano key rang flat, like a heartbeat skipping. Jake ordered a drink he didn't want, stared at his reflection in the bottle, gray at the temples, eyes sharp but haunted, and told himself he was only here to settle his father's land, nothing more. But the land didn't forget so easily. Through the cracked window, he could see the faint blue smudge of the Apache hills in the distance. Something in that outline pulled at him, quiet and steady as a prayer. He remembered being a boy, running those canyons barefoot, laughing beside a girl whose laughter had once sounded like wind through pine needles. The memory twisted his chest, sharp as the edge of a knife. He'd buried that part of himself long ago, under war, whiskey, and regret. But some things don't stay buried. A drunk brushed his shoulder and muttered something about savages in the hills, burned camps, stolen cattle. Jake's jaw tightened. He finished the whiskey, set the glass down hard enough to crack it, and walked out. The wind met him like an old enemy, dry, relentless, full of voices. He saddled up again, riding through the edge of town as shadows stretched long behind him. Every hoofbeat carried him closer to that old dike, that strange call he couldn't name. By the time night took the sky, Red Mesa was a flicker behind him, swallowed by dust and distance. Ahead, the mountains rose dark and silent, the horizon trembling with heat and memory. Jake Thorn didn't know what waited there, only that something was calling, something older than guilt and stronger than fear. And for the first time in years, the man who'd lost everything felt the faintest pull of destiny stirring in the wind. The fire cracked like a heartbeat against the silence, sparks drifting upward into the bruised purple sky as Jake Thorn sat alone, his back against a weathered log, staring into the flames as though they could burn away the memories that clung to him. The desert was endless and empty, its breath dry, whispering through the canyon brush like 1,000 forgotten voices. His horse shifted nearby, uneasy, ears flicking toward the dark. Jake's hand hovered over his revolver, old habit, never far from instinct. Then, the sound came, soft, deliberate, almost human, the kind of sound that didn't belong to coyotes or wind. He stood, eyes scanning the wavering edges of the firelight, every muscle taut, every shadow a thread. But what stepped from the darkness wasn't death, it was something stranger. She moved slowly into the glow, the firelight catching the torn white of her dress, once fine, now shredded by thorns and time. The cloth clung to her in tatters, revealing tan shoulders and the curve of skin weathered by the sun, marked with dirt and something older, survival. For a breath, Jake forgot to move. Her hair, long and dark as midnight, fell across her face, and when she lifted her gaze, His heart jolted as though the past itself had reached through the years to strike him. "Jake," she said softly, her voice trembling uncertain all at once. The sound of it cut through the ears like a blade through fog. He didn't speak, didn't breathe. Her eyes, those dark, unwavering eyes, were the same ones that had once watched the river beside him when they were children, when life had still been innocent, before the soldiers came, before the world burned. His throat tightened. "Who are you?" he asked finally, though he already knew. "It's me," she whispered. "Lena." The name hit him like a gunshot in the quiet. The girl who had vanished in fire and screams, who he had searched for among ashes and graves, was standing there, alive. His first instinct was denial, his second was awe, and his third was something deeper, a pull that rose from the bones. The fire crackled between them, painting her in gold and shadow. He could see the exhaustion in her trembling hands, the dirt streaked across her arms, the torn edges of the dress fluttering in the wind. "You can't be real," he murmured. She took a step closer. "I am," she said. "And I found you." The words were simple, but in them lived years of loss and longing. Jake's grip on his revolver loosened as something fragile and forgotten stirred in his chest. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of rain and memory. He didn't know if she was a ghost, a dream, or a miracle, but as she stood there in the firelight, he knew one thing for certain: the past had found him, and it wasn't finished yet. The thunder rolled low across the canyons, a growl from the heavens that set the firelight trembling. Jake Thorn stood there frozen, staring at the woman before him as the first cold drops began to fall. The years between them felt like smoke, real enough to choke on, but impossible to hold. Lena. The name echoed through him like the crack of a rifle, stirring memories he'd spent half a lifetime burying. He saw flashes, 2 children by the riverbank, sunlight glinting on water, her laughter carrying over the sound of rushing current. He'd carved her a small wooden charm from a branch of cottonwood, said it would keep her safe. She had pressed it to her chest and promised to never take it off. That was before the soldiers came, before the fire and the screaming and the smell of burning sage. He'd been 12, hiding behind a rock as his father shouted for him to stay down, and in that chaos, he'd seen her once more, running toward her burning village, the charm still around her neck. Then she was gone. For years he told himself she died that night, that her spirit had become one with the wind that never stopped crying through those hills. And now, standing here in the storm, she was flesh and blood again. Her torn white dress clung to her, soaked through, ripped so deep at the shoulders that the storm itself seemed ashamed to touch her. Her skin, bronze and sun-worn, shimmered under the rain, and Jake turned his gaze away, not out of shame, but reverence. "You shouldn't be alive," he whispered. Her lips curved, sad, knowing. "Neither should you." The words cut deeper than any bullet could. Lightning split the horizon, illuminating her face, strong, lined with hardship, yet somehow untouched by bitterness. In her eyes he saw the child she once was, and something more, the spirit of a people the world had tried to erase. The wind rose, carrying dust and rain and the faint scent of mesquite. Jake took a step forward, every instinct torn between fear and the aching need to believe. "If this is a dream," he said quietly, "don't wake me." She reached out, her hand trembling as it brushed his cheek, grounding him in something truer than reason. The rain came harder then, drumming on his hat brim, soaking through the earth beneath their boots. She swayed, weakened, and without thinking, he caught her. Her body was cold, lighter than he remembered, fragile as old paper. "You're hurt," he muttered, scanning the gashes and bruises across her arms. She said nothing, only looked up at him as if the years had never passed. Lightning struck again, closer this time, and instinct took over. He lifted her into his arms, her head resting against his chest, and carried her toward his horse. Somewhere above them, thunder cracked open the sky, and Jake Thorn rode into the storm with the past in his arms, bound for a cabin where memory and destiny would meet once more. The rain chased them through the night, drumming on the saddle, whispering through the trees like the voices of ghosts as Jake Thorn rode hard toward the mountains, his arms wrapped protectively around Lena's trembling form. The storm painted the world in silver and shadow, and the narrow trail that wound toward his hidden cavern was slick with mud and pine needles. She clung weakly to him, her breath shallow against his chest, her torn white dress plastered to her skin, heavy with rain and dirt. Every jolt of the horse drew a soft, involuntary sound from her lips, a sound that cut through him deeper than any bullet ever had. When at last the dark shape of the cabin appeared through the sheets of rain, Jake felt something ease inside him, a fragile sense of refuge. He dismounted, cradling her like something sacred, and carried her inside. The old door creaked shut behind them, muffling the storm but not silencing the wind that clawed at the windows. He laid her gently on the cot near the fireplace and struck a match. The flame caught, small at first, then flared to life, casting long, trembling shadows across the walls of rough-hewn logs. The firelight painted her face in shades of golden sorrow. Her eyes fluttered open, dazed, searching, and he saw there the same wild spirit that had danced in them when she was a child by the river. Her dress, once pale as dawn, was now torn to near ruin, great holes exposing tanned skin along her shoulders and collarbone, streaked with mud, blood, and the remnants of battle with the world. He turned away, stoking the fire, not from shame but from the overwhelming reverence that filled him. When he returned to her side, he dipped a cloth into a basin of clean water and began wiping the grime from her arms, her face, her neck. Each mark he found was a story, scratches, bruises, scars carved by survival. She didn't speak, didn't need to. Her silence told him everything he needed to know. Years of hunger, of hiding, of watching the world shift and erase the people she came from. His hands moved carefully, trembling slightly as if afraid she might disappear again if he blinked too long. Her breathing steadied as warmth returned to her limbs, her eyes softening as they followed his movements. The cabin smelled of smoke and rain and pine sap, the kind of scent that carried both comfort and loneliness. Jake sat beside her, elbows on his knees, staring into the fire. "You've been through hell," he murmured, not expecting an answer. She shifted slightly, her voice faint but sure. "So have you." Outside, the storm began to fade, leaving behind only the steady drip of water from the roof and the occasional sigh of wind through the trees. In that fragile quiet, two souls long divided by fate found themselves under one roof again. Two stories written in different bloodlines, now bound by something older than either could name. The wind screamed around the cabin like a wounded thing, tearing through the pines, rattling the shutters, filling the night with a sound that felt half human, half storm. Inside, the fire snapped and hissed, throwing restless shadows over the rough-hewn walls, over Jake Thorn's face, drawn tight with disbelief, and over the woman lying before the flames, her torn white dress clinging to her as though afraid to let her go. The fabric was shredded nearly to threads, revealing long streaks of tanned skin across her upper chest and shoulders, bruised and battered, but alive, alive in a way that no memory could ever be. Lean's voice came low, fragile but steady, each word rising like smoke from a smoldering heart. "They came before dawn," she began, staring into the fire as though she could still see it. "The soldiers. We thought the peace talks meant safety, but they came with torches." Her words cut through the crackle of the flames, and Jake's hands froze around the tin cup he'd been holding. She spoke of capture, of being bound, led like an animal through the dust, forced to march for days while the sun blistered her skin and the cold night stole her breath. She had escaped during a storm, a desperate flight through desert and canyon, hunted like a deer, surviving on rainwater and roots. "I crossed lands that didn't know my name," she whispered, eyes glassy with the reflection of firelight. "And every night, I dreamed of you. Your voice called me back from places darker than death." Jake couldn't speak. His heart pounded in his chest, slow and heavy, as though trying to beat its way free. He wanted to believe her, wanted to, but his mind reeled against the possibility. Years had passed, lifetimes it seemed. He'd buried the boy who loved her. He'd buried everything. Yet here she was, flesh and breath, her presence bending reality itself. She turned her gaze toward him then, and from the tattered folds of her dress, she pulled something small, wrapped in a strip of deerskin. Her fingers trembled as she held it out. "Do you remember this?" The question struck him harder than any blow. He reached out, and when the firelight hit it, the world seemed to stop. It was the charm, the crude little carving he'd made so long ago from a cottonwood branch, its edges worn smooth by time and touch. His initials were still burned faintly into the back, half-faded, but real. Jake's breath left him in a ragged sound, somewhere between a laugh and a sob. His vision blurred, the heat from the fire mingling with the tears he hadn't shed in years. "Lena," he murmured, his voice breaking like tri-timber. "It's really you." She smiled faintly, weary, but there was light behind it, something unbroken. "I told you," she whispered. "You carved your promise into this wood, and I followed it back to you." Outside, the wind roared again, but inside the cabin, time stood still, and the ghosts that haunted Jake Thorn's soul began to take shape in the flesh of the living. If you've ridden this far with us, dip your hat and hit subscribe to keep the campfire burning. Every day, we bring another tale from the old frontier, of grit, loss, and the kind of courage the West was built on. Until next time, partner, keep your powder dry and your heart wide open to the horizon. The night outside the cabin had gone utterly still, as if even the wind held its breath, unwilling to disturb what was unraveling inside. The fire burned low, its light a trembling heartbeat that cast long shadows across the walls, across the man hunched beside it, head bowed, jaw clenched, eyes hollowed by ghosts. Jake Thorn sat there, his hands trembling over the old wooden charm, the weight of it heavier than iron. The smell of smoke in the room brought memories clawing to the surface, memories he'd spent decades drowning in whiskey and silence. He could see it again as clear as the flames before him, the night the soldiers rode through the canyon, torches blazing, rifles glinting, the sound of gunfire tearing the air apart, the horses screaming, the sky alive with red and death. He had hidden that night, a boy with his father's rifle in his hands, frozen behind the rocks as the world burned below. And among the chaos, he'd seen her, Lena, running toward the blaze, toward her family, toward everything he was too afraid to protect. His father's hand had held him back, and that restraint had become a curse that never left his bones. His voice came out rough, scraped raw from years of holding it in. "I saw it happen," he said, the words breaking like brittle glass. "I saw them burn your home. I could have done something. I should have, but I didn't. I just watched." His hands were shaking so badly that the charm slipped between his fingers, landing near the fire with a dull thud. He didn't move to pick it up. Lena lay on the cot, her face half in shadow, the torn edges of her dress fluttering softly in the draft. Her skin, bronzed and glistening in the firelight, bore the faint sheen of tears he hadn't seen fall. She didn't speak right away, didn't rush to soothe or condemn him. Instead, she studied him, the man who had once been a frightened boy, seeing the guilt that had carved him hollow. When she finally spoke, her voice was quiet, steady, and it carried the weight of truth rather than comfort. "You were just a boy," she whispered. "We both were." The words struck him like a hammer against stone, and something inside him cracked, clean and deep. His chest heaved, the breath leaving him in broken gasps as if his body had forgotten how to breathe. Decades of silence, of buried grief and shame, flooded out all at once. He pressed his palms to his face, shaking, the sound of his own sobs strange and unfamiliar. Lena reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Warm, steady, real. It wasn't forgiveness she gave him. It was something quieter, harder, understanding. The fire hissed, collapsing inward, throwing sparks toward the ceiling. And in that fragile hush that followed, Jake felt something shift within him. Not absolution, not peace, but space enough to breathe. The ghosts still lingered, but for the first time, they didn't crush him. They simply sat beside him, silent witnesses to the start of something like healing. The dawn came gray and heavy, the air thick with the smell of damp pine and distant rain. Jake Thorn stood at the cabin window, his silhouette hard against the growing light, watching the slow crawl of morning mist over the valley. Beyond that mist lay Red Mesa, a town that never forgot how to hate. Somewhere down there, words were already spreading like wildfire. "Thorn's gone soft. He's hiding one of them." The old marshal's turned. He could almost hear the murmurs twisting through the saloon, past cracked lips and sharper tongues. It wouldn't take long for those words to reach the wrong ears. He knew the kind of men that talk could rouse, the kind who didn't need reason, only excuse. His hand tightened on the curtain's edge. Outside, the forest seemed to shift. Birds scattered suddenly, the silence that followed too sharp, too still. Someone was out there, watching. The memory of his old badge burned in his mind. It shone now nothing but tarnish and regret. Once, he'd stood beside the law. Now the law was hunting him. He turned from the window, his face set in quiet resolve. Lena sat by the fire, the morning glow catching in her dark hair, her torn white dress still clinging to her like a second skin. The fabric hung in tatters, bearing her sun-darkened shoulders and collarbone, streaked with faint traces of soot and the night's chill. She was mending a small tear with trembling hands. Though it was an impossible task, the dress was beyond saving, like everything else that had survived too much. When she looked up, questioning without words, "They'll come soon," he said quietly. "Men who think they're the hand of justice." She didn't flinch, didn't speak. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as though listening for something only she could hear, the whisper of horses, the breath of the land, the rhythm of danger drawing near. "Will you fight them?" she asked softly. He hesitated. "If they give me a choice, no. But men like that don't give choices." Her gaze lowered to the fire, her voice little more than a whisper. "Then they'll die for their fear." Jake walked over, crouched by her side, and took her hand. It was warm, calloused, trembling just a little. "I've seen too much dying," he said, his voice low. "You deserve more than that." She looked up at him then, eyes steady, full of something he hadn't seen in years, faith. "Maybe we both do." The wind outside shifted, a faint creak of wood, a snap of twig, too deliberate to be nature. Jake's hand went to the revolver at his side. For a moment, neither spoke, the silence between them stretching tight as a drawn bowstring. Then, when the noise faded again into the forest hush, he exhaled, slow. "We've got a little time," he murmured. She nodded, and he sat beside her, their shoulders brushing, sharing warmth in a world that had none to spare. The fire cracked, the storm gathered, and for one fragile heartbeat, peace lived inside the cabin like a dying flame that refused to go out. The dawn crept slowly through the cracks of the cabin walls, turning the dying embers in the hearth to veins of gold, spreading a gentle warmth that could not quite reach the weight of what hung between them. Jake Thorn sat by the window, boots braced against the worn floorboards, rifle leaning within easy reach, watching the forest come alive again. Mist curling low, branches heavy with dew, the faint call of a mourning dove echoing somewhere far off. Behind him, Lena stirred, her breath shallow, steady, the light spilling across her like a tender accusation. Her white dress, tattered beyond repair, caught the morning glow in torn fragments, revealing the deep bronze of her shoulders, the curve of her collarbone, the marks of a life carved by hardship and strength. She sat up slowly, her dark hair falling loose, the soft sound of fabric brushing her skin mingling with the whisper of wind outside. For a moment, she said nothing, only stared at the fire's faint flicker as though searching for words that had burned too long inside her. When she finally spoke, her voice was low, shaped by exhaustion and truth. "They say I killed a man," she began. Jay turned, watching her carefully. "Did you?" She lifted her gaze to meet his, and in her eyes he saw not fear, but a weary kind of defiance. "I killed many," she said softly. "Men who came to burn our homes, who called it progress. They rode under the rancher Harlan Pike, the one who claims this land now. They came at night, shot our horses, dragged women by their hair. I fought. I had to." The confession hung between them like smoke, heavy but unashamed. "They call me outlaw, savage, murderer," she went on, her voice trembling but her chin lifted. "But I was defending my people, what little we had left. Every scar I carry," her hand brushed the edge of a bruise along her upper arm, "I earned trying to keep the world from taking everything." Jake's heart clenched. He had seen men die for less, men forgiven because their skin matched the dust of the town streets. He saw her then not as the girl by the river, nor the phantom from the firelight, but as the woman she had become, stronger than the land that sought to erase her, her courage forged from loss and resistance. "You did what they made you do," he said quietly, "and now they hunt you for it." She gave a small, broken laugh. "They hunt me because I lived." Her eyes glimmered with something raw, hope, maybe, or the memory of it. Jake stood, stepping closer, the wood creaking under his boots. "You're safe here," he said. "I'll protect you." She shook her head, the faintest smile ghosting her lips. You can't fight the whole valley. His hand found the butt of his revolver, his jaw set. I've fought worse. The words were steady, heavy as a vow. Outside, the sun broke fully over the horizon, spilling light through the window and across their faces, two souls caught between past and promise, standing on the thin edge of a peace that could not last. The morning broke clear and blue after a night of uneasy silence, the air crisp and sharp enough to sting the lungs. Jake Thorn saddled his horse as the first shafts of sunlight slipped through the pines, turning the mist into a pale golden haze. Lena stood nearby, her dark hair tousled by the breeze, her torn white dress fluttering softly against her tan skin. The fabric, ragged and thin, revealed the sun-bronzed lines of her shoulders and the faint rise of her collarbone, marked by dirt and the faint bruises of too many nights spent running. Yet in that early light, she seemed almost otherworldly, half woman, half memory. Jake mounted and extended his hand. She hesitated only a moment before placing her small, scarred hand in his. He pulled her up behind him, feeling the warmth of her against his back, the steady rhythm of her breath blending with the horse's steps. They rode through the forest trails without speaking, the sound of hoofbeats muffled by the soft earth, pine needles crunching beneath. The air carried the scent of rain-soaked bark and distant wildflowers. It had been years since Jake had come this way, yet every bend of the path, every curve of the hill seemed carved into his memory. When they reached the ridge, the land opened before them, a vast sweep of desert and green veins of river threading through it. The sight of the old riverbed below caught him like a fist to the chest. He reined in the horse, and they both stared down at it, the place where two children had once laughed, splashed, dreamed of a world that would never come. Dismounting, Jake helped her down, and they walked slowly toward the dry edge where water had once danced in sunlight. The earth was cracked and pale, the air filled with the faint whisper of wind through brittle reeds. Lena knelt, running her fingers through the dust. "It's gone," she murmured, her voice breaking on the wind. "Like my people. Scattered. Some to the north, some to the earth." She looked up at him then, eyes dark with a pain that time hadn't managed to dull. "There's nowhere left for me, Jake. No home to go back to." He crouched beside her, his shadow falling over hers, and for a long moment, neither spoke. Words would have broken something sacred in that silence. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small bundle, a strip of soft leather, the remnants of the Apache charm she once gave him before the fire took everything. He placed it in her palm. "Then stay," he said quietly. "Here, with me." Her eyes searched his, the corners trembling with disbelief, with longing. "Not out of pity?" she asked. He shook his head. "Because I never stopped waiting." The wind swept between them, carrying the cry of a hawk across the open sky, and for that one still, wordless moment, the world seemed to breathe again. The ghosts of the past drifted away on the wind, and what remained was simple and unbroken, the promise of two souls finding their way back home. The moon rose blood-red over the pines, staining the forest in its dreary glow, as if the heavens themselves were warning of what was to come. Jake Thorn stood on the porch of his cabin, boots planted firm on the old wood, revolver hanging loosely by his side. The rifle leaned against the doorframe, within reach, though he hoped not to need it. He could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, could sense the danger before it showed its face. Behind him, through the cracked window, the firelight flickered softly over Lena's figure, her torn white dress faintly luminous in the dimness, the fabric clinging to her skin where it was ripped, bearing the bronze of her shoulders and the curve of her collarbone. She was crouched by the hearth, her eyes flicking toward the door with each whisper of wind. The first sound came, a distant crunch of boots on gravel, the snort of horses, the low murmur of men. Jake's jaw tightened. "Stay inside," he said quietly. Lena rose, her voice barely more than breath. "Jake." He turned slightly, their eyes meeting through the sliver of light that fell between them. "Whatever happens, don't come out." Then the shadows broke. 5 riders emerged into the clearing, their faces half lit by the hellish glow of the moon. At their head was Deputy Cole, once Jake's closest ally, now a man drunk on pride and power. Thorn. He barked, reining his horse to a stop a few yards from the porch. "You got something that don't belong to you." Jake's voice was calm, steady. "Ain't nothing here but peace, Cole. You should try it sometime." The deputy's laugh was sharp, brittle. Peace? You're harboring a killer, Jake. An Apache outlaw. The law wants her. Hell, the valley wants her. Jake's gaze hardened. The law ain't what it used to be. Not when men like you wear the badge. The deputy's hand hovered over his holster, and for a long heartbeat, the world held its breath. Then Jake spoke again, his voice low and even. You take one more step toward this cabin, and you won't take another. But pride is louder than reason. One of the men cursed, raised his rifle, and the night exploded. The first shot tore through the silence, the muzzle flash lighting the clearing like lightning. Jake's revolver answered in the same breath, each shot precise, deliberate, fueled by grim resolve. The fight was short, brutal, inevitable. When the smoke cleared, two men lay in the dirt, the others retreating into the trees, their courage shattered. Jake staggered back, clutching his side, crimson spreading through his shirt. Lena burst through the door, ignoring his plea to stay hidden. She fell to her knees beside him, pressing her hands hard against the wound, her torn dress soaked in his blood. Hold on, she whispered, her words a desperate prayer in Apache and English alike, tears streaking her dirt-stained cheeks. Above them, the blood moon watched in silence as love and violence met beneath its terrible light. The first light of dawn spilled gently over the mountains, soft and golden, cutting through the fading smoke that still lingered in the clearing like the ghost of violence past. Inside the cabin, the world held its breath. Jake Thorn lay pale against the rough blankets, his shirt soaked dark where blood had bloomed through the night, every breath shallow and rasping, each one sounding like it could be his last. The fire had burned low, throwing only a faint orange glow across the floorboards, across Lena's bowed figure beside him. Her hands, darkened by the sweat and blood, pressed against the wound that refused to close, the smell of iron and pine sap heavy in the air. Her torn white dress was streaked crimson now, clinging to her skin, the large rips revealing her tan shoulders, her collarbone, the rise and fall of her breath as she fought against panic and exhaustion. When he stirred, she lifted her head sharply, relief flooding her face. His voice came weak, rough as gravel. You should go, he whispered, eyes half closed. They'll come back. You've got to run. She shook her head, the loose strands of her hair falling across her face. No. Her tone was soft but steady, unshakable. He tried to push himself up, but pain flared through his side, and he fell back with a groan. Lena, he rasped, you don't understand. If they find you here, then they find me, she interrupted, her voice stronger now, her gaze locked on his. I've been running all my life, Jake. From fire, from hate, from men who think the world belongs to them. Not anymore. The final words were quiet, but they carried the weight of years, defiance, grief, freedom all wound into one fragile breath. Outside, the first rays of sunlight broke through the canopy, painting her face in gold, turning the edges of her torn dress into the shimmer of something almost holy. For a long moment, Jake just stared at her, seeing not the broken fugitive or the lost girl from the river, but the woman who had survived everything this land could throw at her. You don't owe me this, he murmured. Maybe not. But maybe I owe it to myself. The silence that followed was tender, almost sacred. The wind slipped through the cracks in the walls, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. The world outside was waking again. Birds calling, branches rustling, life daring to return. Jake reached for her hand, his fingers cold and shaking, and she took it without hesitation. In her touch, he felt something shift deep inside him, a lightness he hadn't known since boyhood. You were always stronger, he said quietly. No, she replied. We just never stopped being the same. The fire crackled softly between them, the light of morning flooding the cabin like a promise. In that fragile peace, surrounded by the echoes of all they'd lost, Jake Thorn saw it clearly for the first time, the bridge between two worlds, not built by war or vengeance, but by the quiet, unyielding grace of love that refused to die. Weeks passed, and the mountains slowly swallowed the memory of blood and thunder. The snows melted early that year, feeding the streams that ran down through the canyons where the pines grew thick and the air tasted of rain and pine smoke. Red Mesa spoke their names in whispers, Jake Thorn, the fallen marshal, and the Apache woman who'd come out of the wilderness like a ghost made flesh. Some said he'd bled out in his cabin, that she buried him under the cedars and vanished into the hills. Others swore they'd seen two riders at dawn, heading west through the fog, her torn white dress glimmering faintly in the light, her hair flowing behind her like dark river water. The truth, as always, lives somewhere between rumor and dream, far from the town's reach, deep among the ridges where the world grew quiet again. A small fire burned each night against the cold. A cabin stood there, rebuilt from ruin, its chimney curling thin smoke into the morning sky. Inside, the scent of pine resin and bread filled the air. Jake moved slower now, a man marked by scars but still standing, his strength quiet, tempered. Sometimes he would stop his work, leaning against the doorway, watching Lena as she gathered herbs by the stream, her white dress, still torn and worn, catching the sunlight through its holes, her brown shoulders bare and unashamed. She had mended what she could, but some wounds weren't meant to disappear. They were meant to remind. In the evenings, when the sun sank behind the ridge, they would sit in silence, the sound of wind weaving through the trees like a lullaby. She would hum old Apache songs, soft and low, and Jake would close his eyes, letting the sound carry him to a place beyond guilt and grief. Once, as the wind shifted, she turned to him and said, "The land forgets the names of men, but not their hearts." He looked at her for a long time before answering, "Then maybe it'll remember ours." And she smiled, that quiet, knowing smile that had haunted him since childhood. Seasons began to turn, and Red Mesa slowly forgot the faces of those who had left it. But the mountains remembered. Travelers passing through the high trails spoke of hearing voices on the wind, hers, mostly soft, melodic, calling a name that disappeared into the sigh of the pines. Sometimes, they said, if the night was still enough, you could hear another voice answer, rough and low, like stone against stone. No one ever found the cabin, though a few claimed to have seen smoke rising where no one lived. Whether they lived or died didn't matter anymore. What mattered was that somewhere, love had taken root in a place where hate once burned. And as the story faded into legend, only one question remained, carried on the breath of the wind itself. If love can survive the fire, what else might be reborn? If this story stirred a memory or two, saddle up with us again. Hit subscribe and help keep these old frontier tales alive. Out here, every name, every trail, every sunset still matters. So till we meet again, friend, keep your hat tipped to the past and your heart pointed west.